You're listening to episode 243 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Brad Warner returns to speak about his exploration of Dogen's Shobogenzo, Don't Be a Jerk, and other practical advice from Dogen, Japan's greatest Zen master. If you're a Soto Zen person, as I've been, you've probably at least heard of the great work from the founder of our lineage, Shobogenzo. It can be a challenging piece to absorb, though, and translating such deeply cultural metaphors and ways of living in a world to a contemporary Western audience is even more difficult. So I'm very glad to see another approach being used, one that will likely ruffle some Zen feathers, to try to share the nuance of Dogen's words. Brad Warner was born in Ohio, grew up in Africa, and lived in Japan for 11 years, where he got ordained as a Zen monk. He now resides in Los Angeles, California. He began sitting when he was 18 years old under the instruction of Tim McCarthy, and was made a Dharma heir of Gudo Nishijima Roshi in the futuristic year 2000. He used to work for a company that made movies about giant radioactive lizards eating Tokyo, and now he writes books like the one we're talking about today. Special thanks to our friend Kim Corbin of New World Library for her coordination of today's interview. Thanks, Kim. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Suizen tea. Our guest today is Brad Warner. Brad, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I think you're going for the record. This is your fourth visit. You were on with us way back, episode 45, to talk about sex in Zen, and then again for Hardcore Zen Strikes Again, and most recently for There Is No God, and He's Always With You. And today we're going to be talking about your new book, and I got to say, this is my favorite of the titles, Don't Be a Jerk, and other practical advice from Dogen, Japan's greatest Zen master. Mm-hmm. We've already talked about your background, so folks are familiar with that. So let's just dive in a little bit into this book, which is a little different than your others. It's not a translation. It's not a totally new book. Let's call it a reboot of Dogen's Shobogenzo, the true treasury of the Dharma Eye. Can you say a little bit about the Shobogenzo itself and what that is?
Well, as you've already noticed, Shobogenzo is a hard-to-pronounce title. It translates to Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and it's an 800-year-old book written by a guy named Dogen, who was a Japanese Zen monk who lived in the 1200s. He was born in the year 1200, so it's always easy to figure out how old he was when he wrote a certain piece, which I've given the dates for all the pieces that I used in this book. Buddhism had been around for a few hundred years in Japan as an intellectual sort of pursuit for study. But by the time Dogen arrived on the scene in the year 1200, it had only been about 100 years since there'd been any sort of formal monastic practice in Japan. And it was kind of just getting to its feet. And Dogen lost both his parents when he was very young. By the age 7, that's when his mother died. His father had died a few years before that. Because of this sort of traumatic thing, he got very interested in trying to find what's the truth of life, before I lose it. And in pursuit of that, he entered a monastery in what's known as the Tendai sect. It was about the only monastery that was available to him at the age of 12, which was not unprecedented, but was unusual. That's unusually early, but of course there had been monks that young prior to him. But he was probably in his particular monastery the youngest kid there. And he had this one question for the older monks, which was, if, as Buddhism says, we are all perfect intrinsically as we are, then why do we need to meditate and why do we need to pursue all this learning and stuff? And nobody could give him a satisfactory answer. So he ended up traveling with another monk over to China to try to find a more direct and pure form of Buddhism. China at the time was the sort of center of world civilization. Really, 800 years ago, it was arguably the most advanced country on earth, even including the nations of Europe at the time. So he went to China, studied with a few teachers there, was mostly unsatisfied, but then he found one teacher who taught a practice called shikantaza, which is just sitting. So it's a kind of completely undirected sort of meditation. Now, every other meditation form Dogen had pursued until then had a goal in mind, but this had no goal at all. And it's still a revolutionary sort of thing to have a meditation practice that has absolutely nothing it's trying to attain with the practice.
And one of the most challenging of the
for sure,
practices as well.
For sure, it's really challenging because I always tell people when I teach it that I can teach you the technique in about 5 minutes. It literally doesn't take any longer than that, but it'll take you a lifetime to figure out, what you're doing with it. So he brought this back to Japan and he started writing. And he was 27 years old when he got back, and that's when he started his career of writing. And eventually, after writing a lot of pieces of trying to explain Buddhism clearly in his own language, which was Japanese, which had not really been done very much up until then, it became this gigantic book, which has 95 chapters. I've only worked on 20 or 22 of them, depending on how you count the chapters for this book. And that's what Shobogenzo is. And Shobogenzo has this interesting history in that it was kind of lost for a few hundred years and really only began to be seriously studied even in Japan in the 20th century. In the 1920s, there was a kind of a big burst of interest in it academically in Japan. This eventually found its way to our countries, and to America, to Europe, to the English-speaking countries of the world. Now there are about half a dozen English translations of Shobogenzo, but they're all, to varying degrees, pretty academic. My own teacher did one that it's extremely thorough and an extremely detailed, well-done translation, but it is nearly impossible to read, which is the case for almost every translation that exists right now. So what I've tried to do with this book is kind of not exactly dumb it down, because I don't want to do that, but I want to try to present the same ideas that Dogen is presenting in Shobogenzo, but in a more contemporary language, a more American language, and hopefully not diluting it too much in the process, although I think a bit of dilution is unavoidable when you do that.
For an 800-page text, yes. And as I recall, the Shobogenzo is one of really it's the banner product of Dogen's writing time, is the Shobogenzo.
Yeah, for sure. It's his life's work. He did a lot of other pieces of writing besides Shobogenzo, but Shobogenzo was definitely the one he put the most into. And
he also, interestingly, passed away fairly young. I think he was in his 50s. Is that right?
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody today, a monk up at Tassajara, and neither of us was sure if he was 54 or 53. Depends on how you count the years. And the Japanese in those days had a different way of counting it. But yeah, he was quite young, which is unfortunate for him. And in some ways, possibly slightly fortunate for us. I don't know if this is a nice way to put it. But one of the things that appeals to me about Dogen is that most of his writing was done when he was in his 30s and 40s. If you look at the dates of the chapters, he started very early in life. So he had a lot a lot behind him even when he started it at age 27, but he also was a younger person, and so you're not getting the words of this kind of grizzled old master who's seen it all. You're getting the words of a young person who's in the thick of things, trying to figure it out himself, and has a lot to say and has a lot of wisdom to offer, even in his youth.
That's one of the appealing things about Dogen's writings is that there seems to be a tone of a bit more life to them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. He's a lively guy. Sometimes that's a turnoff for certain people because he can be a bit cantankerous and a bit angry. Maybe that's, I came from this punk rock background, and maybe that's what appealed to me. Is he sounds like the guys that wrote for the zines who are just, angry about things sometimes.
So your title of the book is a riff off of the chapter Shoaku Makusa, Avoid Doing Wrong. Tell us a little bit more about how you picked this as the title based on that chapter.
Well, I started working a bit randomly. It was only after I'd worked on a couple of chapters that I decided to work on the whole thing chronologically, because I wasn't sure how I was going to do this. So one of the earliest ones I did was that Shoaku Makusa, mostly because it appealed to me. And I kind of felt that what he's saying in this is kind of it's kind of a good thing that ought to appeal to Western thinkers who think about these things, because we're all obsessed in Western philosophy, or I'm not really a Western philosopher, but in Western philosophy you're obsessed with often the problem of evil, what they call. And what Dogen puts forth in this is it seems evident that even in Asia there was a little bit of this idea of the problem of evil, which is that why does evil exist in the world, And his solution to that was to say that evil doesn't exist as a thing that sits around up in the sky somewhere or down in hell or wherever waiting for somebody to do it. It's actually in the moment of action. You do what's right, or you don't do what's right. And he feels that this meditation process that he was engaged in, this just sitting process, enabled a person to become more in touch with their own innate intuitive ability to see right and to see what's not right. And the solution to the problem of evil was to simply don't be a jerk. Don't do those things which you can see for yourself are not the right things to do in a moment by moment way. So rather than making a list of morals that says, do this and don't do that and a whole specific list, he was saying that there's an intuitive knowing of right and wrong, which is often hard for people to believe if they haven't actually worked on it themselves. But my sense is he's right. I think he's right. I think there is an intuitive sense and we all possess it. But most of us cover that over very, very thoroughly to the point where we can't recognize it anymore.
Or unfortunately sometimes use the excuse, oh, it's not on my list, therefore it's okay for me to get away with this. Or I can twist the words enough that it's okay to vindicate what I'm doing.
Sure, yeah, that's the thing. You can think your way into a justification for absolutely anything. It was one of the shocking revelations I had in my days of sitting in temples, working on myself all day long, those kind of things, of watching my own mind's ability to justify anything, even when I knew for a fact that it was not the right thing to do. I could spin a justification, and you can see that happening all over the world, and a lot of tragedies, I think, happen because people just convince themselves that something they know is wrong is right.
So let's shift a little bit. You talk about Dogen as a feminist, and I'm wondering if you might expand on that.
Yeah, he wrote this real interesting essay called, let me see if I can remember right, Raihai Tokuzui is a Japanese title. And it translates to prostrating yourself to that which has attained the marrow. And that sounds very, beautifully Buddhist and confusing, and everybody loves that sort of garbage. But what it really means is honoring anyone who expresses the truth, no matter what their station in life. And he starts off by talking about a koan about a small child who is speaking the truth, and how this great master listens to this 7-year-old girl because she's speaking the truth. But he's an interesting writer in that he's not afraid to go off on tangents, and he goes off on this long sort of tangent about certain practices that were common practice in the Buddhism of his day, such as one that said that there were certain sacred places that only men could enter. So even a woman who had become a Zen master couldn't enter these spaces, or a nun couldn't enter these spaces, but Dogen gives the example of like a drunk bum off the street could walk right in because he's a man. And the idea of that certain male monks held that they would never look at or touch a woman, never speak to a woman. And he says that's nonsense. There's nothing intrinsic in being male that makes you superior to someone who's female. And he spends an awful lot of time reasserting this idea. So much so that I had to cut quite a bit of it, maybe even most of it, out of my rewording of the text, because it's a bit more than people in the 21st century probably need to hear. We kind of have that idea, at least as a cultural norm, if not something that everybody pursues and believes. But I think it's interesting because he was writing this 800 years ago in Japan, and Japan is still a country which in which women are often treated as inferiors. And during Dogen's time, it was just considered a matter of just, that's the way it is. Women are inferior to men. People didn't even question that, which is probably why he spends so much energy repeating over and over that this is not the right view. So even though the word feminism is a more modern invention, I think I traced it back when I was doing the research to about 150 years ago or something in France. Was the first time this word had appeared. I think it's okay to retroactively call him a feminist, because he was standing up for a lot of those ideals. So that's why I decided to title the chapter that.
So what did you like best about working on this book?
It was interesting. The inspiration came from seeing this book called God is Disappointed in You, in which the author tries to take the entire Christian Bible and put it into his own words. So that was my inspiration, and I decided to see if I could do this with Dogen. And what was interesting was, I had to do a lot of the kind of stuff I generally avoid, which is sort of Buddhist scholarship. So I had on my kitchen table this pile of different translations of Shobo Genzo and a couple of Japanese editions of Shobo Genzo that I could look at and go line by line through the thing. And it was in a way kind of tedious work, but really weirdly fun in a kind of nerdy way, because I had to go and I couldn't just rely on any of these translations. I was mainly relying on my teacher's translation, which of course I'm biased towards that version, but even it is, as I said, kind of difficult to read. So I was going with that and with several other translations and seeing where they matched and where they didn't match, and then getting into the Japanese original and working on that. I lived in Japan for 11 years and learned to speak contemporary Japanese, but this is 800-year-old Japanese, which is a whole other animal. So it was really interesting to kind of work on that and finding out things about the existing translations that you would only find out if you did that. Like, there are several places that I wouldn't say there's any earth-shatteringly important spots like this, but there are several spots I found where all of the translators were just guessing, where there's no two ways around it. Everybody who got to that line just had to guess what it meant, because some of them were written in very arcane Chinese that even Chinese speakers these days, I asked some who I know couldn't figure out the meaning of. And you're just kind of trying to guess from context what some of this stuff could mean. So that was really interesting to see the nuts and bolts, the undercarriage of what these translations were.
I noticed in the book, as with your other books, you put a lot of yourself in there. You have your own experiences, personal stories in here. I'm wondering if any of those that you put in here that you can recall stand out for you as being like, yeah, this is the place I got to tell about X, this thing that happened.
God, no, it's funny. I tend to get very, very intense when I write a book and then immediately forget everything that's in it. So then 6 months later, when the book is published, I'm doing interviews about it and I can't recall anything that's in it. So I should probably read it myself. A lot of what Dogen wrote shaped my life in ways that I probably wasn't consciously aware of, at least not all the time. And how much this idea of ethics and this idea of the importance of meditation has meant to me. It's been most of my life now officially. I turned that corner sometime in the, I don't know, end of the 90s or something, to where it went from being, part of my life was spent doing this to most of my life. And it's really been important to me. I mentioned in the book the three people who were the conduits to Dogen for me. The main one being Nishijima Roshi, who was my teacher in Japan, who wrote this very, very thorough English translation of it. And then my previous teacher, Tim McCarthy, who I still see, the American, who didn't really talk so much about Shobogenzo overtly, but you could see it informed his life in much the same way it's informed mine. And then Kazuaki Tanahashi, who also produced a very good translation of Shobogenzo, who I've become friends with in the last couple of years, who's a Dogen scholar and also kind of an amateur. He doesn't have any specific degree that would make you think he's a Dogen scholar. He's mostly an artist, a painter and calligrapher, but he's very interested in Dogen and took it upon himself to try to figure out what was in there. So those people have meant a lot to me, and that's how I got it, was through people rather than through reading it, I think.
I think that's the experience for a lot of us who started in the Zen tradition, is that it's very experiential, more than we might see in other places, where you're sitting, you may be trying Kodi fingers here, trying shikantaza, and running into that simple but really, really hard. We can give you the instructions, but exploring this is the work of a lifetime. And I'm wondering if you found that to be sort of what you're characterizing here with your teachers, is that embodiment side of the practice.
Yeah, definitely. My Nishijima used to say that it was a philosophy of action, and when I first heard that, he kind of used English in a strange way. I thought he meant it was a philosophy that talked about action, but what he meant was that it was a philosophy that you do. So you don't just read this philosophy; you actually try to do it in action, in daily life. And that embodiment, it doesn't mean that the people who work on Dogen's type of truth suddenly become kind of perfect examples and perfect role models or any of that. But it does inform the way you behave and the way you do the individual things that you have to do in life. I think that's really a crucial thing. And just seeing it embodied in a human being meant a lot to me.
Awesome. Well, our guest today, Brad Warner. You can find out more about what Brad is doing at hardcorezen.info. Brad, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.